Hello, and welcome to My Week in Baseball. I'm your host, Phil S. Truth Harrison. You're listening to episode number 7. This episode is published as a podcast on Buzzsprout and Spotify, and is also available in a video version on YouTube. And I'm excited to announce we've recently been added to Stitcher and iHeartRadio, so you have many ways to listen to the show. As always, a special shout out to RES Truth of Brunjo Productions for the intro music created especially for this show. Learn more at brunjo.com. That's BRUNJO.com. All right, today's topics are a quick addendum to our batting average discussion from last episode, a new feature I'm calling the Goose Moment, which this week involves a unique way to prevent scoring, the Phillies firing of manager Joe Girardi, and the expectations around managers, a quick tribute to baseball writer Roger Angell, and of course, we'll also have our blast from the past, a timely Blimerick, and the cap of the day. So let's get right to it. Okay, in our last episode, we compared two eras, the 1950s to the 2011-2020 period. And the main conclusion from that was that home run output had increased dramatically, more than 30%. I neglected to mention an obvious difference between those two eras. In the 1950s, there were 12 teams who all played before the designated hitter. In the recent era, half the teams, 15 out of 30, did have the DH. So professional DHs obviously are paid to hit and hit with power. So that certainly contributed to the increase in home runs. Although it didn't increase the number of runs scored, though. So to find out more, be sure to listen to episode 6. And now it's time for the Goose Moment. This is a moment to honk about something new, interesting, maybe a cool play, or could be a rant about MLB. So here it is, today's inaugural Goose Moment. Recently, the Toronto Blue Jays AA team, the New Hampshire Fisher Cats, came up with a creative, spur-of-the-moment way to keep their opponents from scoring. And their opponents were, and I'm not making this up, the Rubber Ducks of Akron. Anyhow, in the 6th inning, with 2 on, a base hit to right sent the runner around third and headed home to score. Catcher Chris Beck tried to swipe tag the runner, twice actually, but missed. So he simply sat down right on top of the plate. There was absolutely no way the Rubber Ducks runner could get to home plate. So he simply acquiesced and walked up to the catcher to be tagged out. Brilliant. Maybe this will start a new trend. On to our next topic, the Phillies firing of manager Joe Girardi. The Phillies came into this season with the 4th highest payroll in the majors and their highest ever as a team at nearly $233 million, behind only the Mets, the Dodgers, and the Yankees. So expectations were quite high, especially after high-profile off-season signings of sluggers Nick Castellanos and Kyle Schwarber, in addition to already having reigning NL MVP Bryce Harper and first baseman and slugger Rhys Hoskins. An impressive lineup on paper, at least. So at the time of Girardi's release, which was today, June 3, 2022, the Phillies record stood at 22-29. So with 51 games played, just a little under a third of a season, they were 7 games below 500, 12 games back of the first place Mets, and 5.5 games back in the wild card race. Now that's a wild card race with 12 teams, 6 in each league, who would make the playoffs. Now, sabermetrics guru Bill James developed something called baseball's Pythagorean theorem, and it's based on the number of runs scored versus those a team allows, and based on that, how many games could you expect a team to win? So let's just take a look at that for a second. The Phillies were 22-29, but based on the Pythagorean, they should have been 26-21. If they had that, if they had met their expectations based on the number of runs they'd scored and allowed, they would actually be in second place, just 6 games back of first, and they would be in the playoffs, and Girardi would still have a job. So interesting. Okay, now let's talk about the manager's role, right? Should Girardi still have a job? What can the manager control? Well, certainly the manager can't control how the players actually perform. They can't control injuries. They can't control who the general manager puts on their team. But they should be able to influence the attitude, the motivation of the team, knowing what each player needs. And I'll sidetrack for just a moment to say that Jim Leyland, in his tenure with the Detroit Tigers, was especially good at that, of knowing how to motivate each individual player, how to give them the lift they needed or the push they needed or the kick they needed to help them get better. So that's the kind of thing a manager needs to be able to do. They also need to be able to put the best lineup and pitching staff on the field on any given day and to give their team the best chance they can to win, right? That's what the manager does. They kind of keep it all together. They keep people motivated. They put the best team on the field that day based on what's happening, who they're playing, and so on. This year, the Phillies have underperformed their expected win-loss record. And so that could fairly or unfairly be blamed on the manager. In this case, it likely means that they've won some blowouts. They've scored a decent number of runs, but they've lost the close games. And in close games, each decision by a manager has a greater influence on the outcome of the game. So understandably, when you're significantly below the expected one loss, the manager's likely to get blamed for that. So let's look at how the Phillies have done in some departments. At the time of Girardi's dismissal, the Phils are 11th out of 30 teams in runs scored, the same as they were last season, which really isn't bad, but certainly below expectations, given that they had some big signings of good hitters in the offseason. As far as pitching goes, they're tied for 18th in earned runs allowed, 18th out of 30, which is not too hot. And they're 21st, close to the bottom of the league in bullpen ERA. So the pitching is not great. Here's the thing. On defense, though, according to total zone fielding runs above average, they're 28th out of 30 teams in the league. And by another measure, defensive runs saved, they are dead last. So they allow more runs than the league average team by quite a lot. So poor defense has certainly hurt them. And although the hitting has been decent, it hasn't been outstanding. Part of the problem is that they only get to have one designated hitter. And as a National League team, this is actually their first year with a DH. Only thing is they have several players on the team that could and probably should be designated hitters. So they're putting people out there in the field that likely would be better off as a DH. And so the team is filled with a lot of people with expectations around their hitting who don't have the best glove in the world. But to me, anyway, now the manager can have some influence on who the team signs and brings in the offseason, but really that's roster construction. And roster construction to me weighs on the general manager, in this case, Dave Dombrowski. That is not really the manager's role, right? They can't control that. Girardi has 14 years experience as a manager. He has more than 1,100 wins, and career, he has a .545 winning percentage, which means he wins about 55% of his games. That is quite good. So he isn't bad, his overall record, but you do need to take into account that he spent most of his time managing the Yankees, and during those years, the Yankees had pretty good rosters. Here's an interesting quote. This is a quote from the general manager, Dave Dombrowski, on why Girardi was fired. Quote, "It's been a frustrating season for us up until this point, as we feel that our club has not played up to its capabilities." There's an understatement. "While all of us share the responsibility for the shortcomings, I feel that a change was needed and that a new voice in the clubhouse would give us the best chance to turn things around." Well, at least he said all of us share in the responsibilities. He should have said, I share in the responsibilities because I constructed the roster. So as you might tell from my tone, Girardi may not have been the best fit for them. That's certainly possible. And from some things I'm reading from the Philadelphia writers and fans, maybe it was time for him to go. But I also think that the manager has a modest amount of influence on how the players actually perform. So I don't know. If you're a Phillies fan, you might be glad to see him go. We'll see how it turns out the rest of the year. They've got about 2/3 of a season to kind of turn things around. And certainly if they play up to the level of expectation, just in the runs scored, runs allowed, even if they kind of continue at that current pace, they should be over 500 and they should be contenders. So we'll see. Maybe it'll turn around. Anyway, enough on that. But we are going to move on to our Blimerick, as we have in every broadcast, a baseball limerick for you. And today it's going to be in honor of all managers, but especially now for Joe Girardi. And here we go, our Blimerick of the day. Though a manager rarely gets fame, surely they take all the blame. When their team doesn't hit and the pitching is in fits, time to fire them. That's sure to light a flame. Okay, next up, a tribute to Roger Angell. Baseball writer Roger Angell recently passed away at the ripe old age of 101. And there are a couple of great quotes from him about baseball. There are actually dozens and dozens. He's a very prolific writer, very good writer of prose. I just picked out a couple. This is one that I saw on most every site where I looked for quotes from him, and it's a good one. Since baseball time is measured only in outs, all you have to do is succeed utterly. Keep hitting, keep the rally alive, and you have defeated time. You remain forever young. I love that idea of you've defeated time. And that is one thing that's brilliant about baseball, is that there is no time clock, although we are likely to see a pitching clock next year. But time really is measured only in outs. And as long as you keep getting on base, keep avoiding outs, the game goes on, your team continues to have a chance to score. And I had one other quote from him that I really liked, which kind of sums up how I feel about the game. So this is Roger Angell. I felt what I almost always feel when I'm watching a ball game. Just for those 2 or 3 hours, there is really no place I would rather be. And although I certainly knew of Roger Angell, I decided to look up some of the books that he'd written. So a few of those titles, and you may have heard of some of these, you may have read some of these, Late Innings, The Summer Game, 5 Seasons, A Pitcher's Story, Season Ticket, and Game Time, to name a few. Many of these were published in the 1970s and 80s, and really well into the 2000s. And I'm embarrassed to say, I realized after reading the titles that I'd never read even one of them. So I'm making a vow to choose one and delve in, and I encourage you to do the same. I'm going to start with Late Innings, which covers 1977 to the summer of 1981, from Reggie Jackson's World Series heroics in those late 70s with the Yankees to the strike in 81. And what a strange season that was, split into 2 halves. That may be something we'll talk about more on a future episode. So thank you, Roger Angell. All right, it's time now for the cap of the day. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube can see it, of course. It is a Washington Nationals cap. The Washington Nationals caps typically come in red, white, or blue. And this one actually is blue. It's been through the wash a few times, so it's kind of a faded blue-gray. And it has the script Washington W on the front. The W is in white, and then it's got kind of like red piping around the W to make it pop out on the blue background of the hat. This is a cap that my daughter got for me on a trip out east back in her school days. They took a democracy tour to the East Coast, visited Washington, D.C., and all the historic sites. And being a baseball fan, she had to bring her dad back a cap. So Thanks to my daughter for this cap. Next up, our blast from the past. And today, our blast from the past, because today's cap was the Washington Nationals, we're going to pick a player that is somehow connected to the Nationals, but not exactly. We're really going to go back a little further to the Montreal Expos because the Nationals were originally the Montreal Expos. And I was going to focus on the Expos' best player in their early years, which was Rusty Staub, who, as some of you will remember, goes on to be a DH for the Detroit Tigers in the late 70s. Anyway, Staub was the best player on that expansion team. But as I was researching it, I actually found a more interesting player, and it's connected to Staub. And that player is Donn Clendenon. And the story around him begins with a trade for Staub. So here's what happened. In 1969, Staub is traded for Jesus Alou and Donn Clendenon. Donn Clendenon refuses to report to his new team. So the Expos ended up sending two other players and $100,000 to Houston to complete the trade. So when I found that out, I thought, okay, I need to know more about Donn Clendenon. This is fascinating. He refused to show up for the trade. He refused to report. What is going on? So I did a little research on him. He was a decent player. He played 12 seasons, mostly for the Pittsburgh Pirates and mostly at first base. And he had a very respectable career, 274 batting average, 771 on base plus slugging, which is an OPS plus of 117. So 17% above league average offensively in his career. And he twice hit more than 20 home runs. What I was curious about was what happened there. Why did he refuse the trade? And then how did this all come about? So from what I can find, and I give credit to fangraphs.com for a lot of detailed information on this particular season and the circumstances leading up to this trade and these decisions. So leading up to this, Clendenon led the National League in striking out in 1968. And so the Pirates chose not to protect him in the expansion draft, which happened in 1969 with the Expos coming into the league. The Expos drafted him, though, not because they wanted to keep him. They drafted him in order to have a veteran player that they could trade for younger talent, which they attempted to do by dealing him to Houston. So basically the plan was, we're going to draft him. We're going to trade this veteran who's been a pretty solid first baseman for many years now. And we're going to get some young talent, which we, as an expansion team, we find really appealing. That's sensible. So they really tried to deal him right away. But Clendenon refuses to report to Houston. So when I delve into this, it sounds like there were quite a few reasons. There wasn't just one reason. He was unhappy with his contract and his salary. So that could certainly be part of it. But it seems to be that it was more about the Houston manager, Harry Walker, who had a poor reputation in working with players of color, and Clendenon was black. And he had already played for that manager during his tenure as a Pirate. So he didn't really want to go and play for Harry Walker again. And that you could understand if the relationship there wasn't good. So this is his age 33 season, and Clendenon announces his retirement. Well, what happens? So Houston would just as soon void the trade. They like some of the other players involved, but they just as soon undo this. But Montreal, they want to keep the trade. So Commissioner Bowie Kuhn steps in and they figure things out. So Clendenon gets a raise and decides to unretire, and he reports to the Expos. But he doesn't do so well for them, and they end up trading him to the Mets. So he only plays 38 games for the Expos. And during that time, he bats .240 with an OPS plus of just 85. That's poor. That's 15% below league average. So they still, and all along, have really wanted to deal him. they didn't want the veteran player. They really are trying to trade him for some younger up and coming players that they can build into a contending team in the future. So moving from a last place team, the Expos, to a contending team in 1969, the Mets, is appealing to Clendenon, who this time accepts the trade, and he greatly strengthens the Mets lineup with an OPS of 777 the rest of the way and an OPS plus of 114, which is a huge improvement over his brief time in Montreal. His bat and his experience helped the young Mets to a first place finish in their division, and they become world champs. These are the famous Miracle Mets of 1969, who went from 9th place the year before to first. So the trade that wasn't ended up being a key piece to that marvelous Mets team of 1969. Well, that's all I have for you today. Join us next time, because honestly, what can be better than talking baseball? Or as Roger Angell put it, there is really no place I would rather be. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Phil Eshtruth Harrison. We'll see you next time on My Week in Baseball.